Veiled Heirs.
The ship's name was Aurora Mare. As it glided across open water, its hull cut through the sunlight like a thin white line, leaving behind it a narrow trail of foam dissolving into the sea. On the upper decks, a carefully curated world of endless comfort and staged spectacle ruled. On the lower decks, the scent of metal mingled with detergent, the hum of constantly running machinery, and the steady rhythm of tired footsteps. Aurora Mare was not an ordinary cruise ship. It was Alexander Cole's pride. He had multiplied his fortune through aggressive moves in the finance sector, then stepped into sea tourism to build a new empire. Aurora Mare was the brightest jewel of that empire. Weeks-long itineraries, exclusive tours touching Mediterranean ports, a limited number of passengers, and a world that promised endless privilege. Alexander watched the morning light reflected on the ship's hull from the same distance every time. From the glass-walled office of his private pier, also built by his order, he would look at the ship waiting in the harbor and feel that everything in his life was under control. He did the same that morning. Espresso cup in one hand, tablet in the other, he was reviewing the details of Aurora Mare's new season-opening cruise. This one would be different from the others. This time, not only clients, but also his own family would be on board. But nothing would be as it appeared from the outside. Alexander had been forming a plan in his mind for weeks. He wanted to truly know Aurora Mare's crew, to see how they behaved without masks and trained smiles. Company reports, feedback forms, management notes, all of them described a flawless customer experience. But Alexander was certain no one ever told him the full truth. Good reports were often written to keep the boss happy. Out in the middle of the sea, within a closed system, he wanted to see how power was really used. This idea hadn't come purely from professional curiosity. It carried a faint trace of hurt. Alexander had been long aware of the growing distance in their family. His wife Olivia had started sleeping in separate rooms. His children, Mia and Ethan, had grown up with the sound of phone calls coming from his home office. To them, their father was more of a figure seen on screens, a name mentioned in the news, or a silhouette behind the door of a room that was always closed when he was home. In one conversation, Olivia had told him she was starting to question whether their lives were real. She said everything was polished like glass, but sharp when you touched it. She said the children were growing up in hotels and VIP lounges instead of building real relationships with real people. Alexander defended himself, insisting he was creating a secure future for them. But his words hadn't softened the tired lines on Olivia's face. The new season cruise of Aurora Mare was a 3-week route across the Mediterranean, departing from Barcelona, stopping at ports like Marseille, Nice, Civitavecchia, Naples, Santorini, and Athens, then returning to the Spanish coast. As Alexander planned to spend this cruise with his family, he also decided to set up a kind of experiment. He called in the ship's captain and a few top executives. He told them he was launching a confidential observation process but would only share full details with a handful of people. Only 3 senior managers he deemed most trustworthy would learn the full story. The rest would simply be told that a special evaluation would take place without knowing who was being evaluated. Alexander's plan was simple, but its impact would be deep. His immediate family, Olivia, Mia, and Ethan, would join this cruise under the identity of ordinary passengers. Instead of luxury suites, they would be assigned interior cabins with no windows. Their clothing, accessories, and appearances would be toned down to hide any trace of wealth. Meanwhile, a number of other passengers would be deliberately elevated, highlighted with artificial importance and visibility. At this point, another group was pulled into the plan, the cruise families. Some senior employees of Aurora Mare had earned the right to bring their families on this season's opening cruise as a reward. Normally, this meant a modest vacation in shared lower-deck cabins. But this time, Alexander ordered a different setup. The cruise families would be brought on board playing the role of luxury guests, placed on the upper decks, and the entire staff would be encouraged to treat them as if they were extremely important guests. This would create the following tableau. One group of important passengers, dressed flashily, acting the part, and drawing attention. Another family dressed plainly, shy in demeanor, looking as if they were traveling on a low-budget package. Everyone would assume the flashy, ostentatious group were those closest to the ship's owner, and that the other family were ordinary tourists, perhaps of limited means. In reality, in this entire staged scene, the true owners of Aurora Mare would be that invisible family in the lower categories, the ones valued the least. As this idea took shape in Alexander's mind, he felt a strange mix of excitement and unease. On one hand, there was an urge to see the truth. On the other, the weight of pulling his own family into an experiment. Yet when Olivia was brought into the plan, she reacted with a surprising calm. When Alexander laid out the plan in detail, she listened without taking her eyes off him for a long time, then simply said she wanted to hear what the children thought.
Mia was 17. She'd spent her school vacations eating breakfast in lounges reserved for special guests in luxury hotels. Ethan was 11 and had learned what his father's name meant by reading stories about him on the internet. Both had grown up with second-hand stories about their father's power in the business world, but hadn't often experienced quiet evenings at home with him. When Olivia sat down with the children to explain, she told them this cruise would be completely different from the vacations they were used to. On the ship, they would hide their identities. They wouldn't tell anyone their father owned the ship. They would be treated like ordinary passengers, and sometimes, perhaps, not treated at all. Mia initially perceived the idea almost like a game. While choosing clothes from her wardrobe, she set aside the plainest, most worn-looking items. Ethan, meanwhile, was both curious and confused as to why his father wanted this. He tried to ask Alexander where this was going several times, but every time, phone calls, meetings, and short, rushed conversations cut his sentences off midway. Although Alexander was the architect of the plan, he positioned himself not at the front of the stage, but behind it. During the cruise, he would only spend a few nights on the ship, mostly traveling back and forth via helicopter from port to port while continuing his work. His family would remain on board for weeks on their own while he observed from a distance through cameras, reports, and occasional brief visits. On departure day, Barcelona's port was bustling. Aurora Mare loomed above the pier, her massive hull towering over the harbor. Flags draped from the decks and passengers visible behind glass balconies created the sense of a festival crowd. Some of those waiting to board were taking selfies, tagging the ship's name on social media, and broadcasting their excitement to the world. At one of the special boarding gates, under a sign reading VIP Embarkation, a group of strikingly dressed people waited. These, in truth, were the families of Aurora Mare's crew, but today they had a very different role. Leading them was the ship's hotel director, Mark Langdon. Mark had worked in tourism for years and prided himself on reading people from their facial expressions. He was one of the executives Alexander trusted most. Under the plan, Mark had partial information. He knew that among these there were special guests who might look like crew families, but were in fact strategically important to the company. Their satisfaction would determine the fate of the entire crew. As Mark looked at the group next to him, he mentally rehearsed how they should be treated. Most were dressed in cautious display, flashy yet seemingly expensive dresses, branded shoes, shiny watches, designer bags. Every detail leaned toward an exaggerated image of wealth. Mark knew this image was intentional and had instructed his staff to treat these guests as if they belonged to the inner circle closest to the ship's owner.
Farther back in the port, at a shaded entrance, another family was about to be admitted. There was no VIP sign at this gate, just a simple number and a small board reading General Boarding. The family waiting there dressed, breathed, and carried their bags in a way that made them almost impossible to notice. Olivia had tied her hair back in a ponytail, left her showy jewelry at home, and wore simple jeans and a light-colored shirt. Mia stood in a plain t-shirt, faded jeans, and worn sneakers. Ethan had a basic backpack with no visible logo. The staff member checking their names on the list showed no sign of recognition. Alexander wasn't there. He would board at a different gate, at a different time, in a different role. In the system, his family appeared as middle-tier package guests staying in interior cabins. When Olivia entered the cabin, she quietly took in her surroundings. The room was clean and orderly, but nowhere near the size they were used to. 2 beds placed close together, a small TV on the wall, and a narrow wardrobe. As she unpacked, she realized this limited space was a concrete example of what Alexander wanted them to experience. Their entire lives, they had been placed in the largest, quietest, most comfortable rooms. Now they would sleep in the mid-decks, hearing the murmur of the crowds. Mia stared up at the small light recessed into the ceiling and felt a faint unease. It wasn't exactly discomfort, more like the tremor of stepping into an unknown world. For the first time in her 17 years, she was starting a trip knowing no one would offer her special treatment. It was both frightening and strangely intriguing. Ethan dropped his bag on the bed and thought of his father's large desk at the office. On that desk, there were always perfectly arranged folders, an expensive pen in one corner, and phone calls that never fully ended. When his father had proposed this experiment, he had called it a kind of game for Ethan. But Ethan had sensed something harder than a game in his father's eyes, as if Alexander wanted to dim the overly bright lights of the world he had built and walk around in the shadows for a while. When the ship set sail, life inside Aurora Mare unfolded in layers. On the top deck, passengers lounged around the pool, waiters moved through with trays of cocktails, and guest relations staff seemed prepared for every question. At the center of this world, Mark Langdon was soaking in first impressions like a sponge. He observed the naturalness of the crew's smiles, the extra attention lavished on the fake VIPs, and the standard treatment given to everyone else.
One of the fake VIP families was that of Elena, a receptionist Mark had worked with for years. Elena's husband David was, in reality, an ordinary man who worked in an auto repair shop. But today, the crisp white shirt chosen for him, the thin blazer over his shoulders, and the metal watch on his wrist put him inside a simulation of the corporate elite. Their children, who normally wore whatever was cheapest and practical, now ran around the deck in new branded t-shirts and fresh sandals. The crew showered this family with attention, constantly offering them refreshments and asking if they needed anything. Elena felt a blend of pride and unease. On one hand, she was thrilled to give her family this luxurious experience. On the other, she knew how far all this was from reality. The only thing she really knew about Alexander's plan was that these people played a key role in the company. Their satisfaction could directly affect careers. So she took both her job and the assigned role very seriously. Down on the lower decks, near the common dining area, Olivia and the children lined up for their first dinner. This dining room, reserved for mid-tier passengers, was packed, the tables placed closer together and the noise level higher. Compared to the specialty restaurants on the upper deck, the waiters moved faster and more mechanically here. As Mia waited in line, she noticed the looks from nearby tables. Some were merely curious glances scanning the crowd. Others were the gaze of people trying to read class from clothing and body language. Olivia sensed her daughter tense and placed a light hand on her arm. That small touch carried a silent sentence: "We're here, and we're together." The head waiter's behavior stood out. Unlike the servers on the upper decks, he looked worn out and impatient. His eyes swept over the tables quickly, calculating in advance who might be more demanding or problematic. In his eyes, Olivia and the kids formed an unimportant profile, simply dressed, not asking about the wine list, not hesitating over menu choices. Such guests usually didn't require much extra effort. Their table was placed in the far back corner of the dining room, close to the kitchen entrance. Every time the door opened, the clatter of metal and a wave of hot air rolled over them. The squeak of service carts cut through conversations like a thin, harsh line. When Mia saw where they'd been seated, a faint disappointment passed through her. Still, she said nothing. This was part of the experiment, and she wanted to see where it would lead. Meanwhile, on the upper deck's specialty restaurant, the table prepared for the fake VIPs stood right in front of the largest panoramic window. White tablecloths, crystal glasses, long-stemmed wine glasses, and gleaming silverware. Everything had been placed with meticulous care. Mark moved around this table, watching his staff's behavior closely and taking notes. When waiters approached, they straightened their posture, softened their voices, and made sure to address the guests by name.
As the days went by, the class lines inside Aurora Mare became increasingly visible. On the upper decks, there were large sunbathing areas, open buffet stations, and private bars. Guests here were distinguished by the colored cards on their wrists, and the staff treated them with extra care. On the lower decks, pool access was limited to certain hours, spaces were more crowded, and options were restricted. Walking around the ship, Olivia and the children often noticed staff glances sliding right past them. When they tried to ask questions, the answers were short and mechanical. The smiles never quite reached the eyes, given out instead like obligatory expressions from a manual. This weighed especially heavily on Mia. She had grown up with doors opened for her, extra options laid out for her, and carefully chosen words used to address her. Now she felt as if she was walking beneath an invisible layer. One afternoon, while looking for a quiet corner to read, Mia tried going up to the upper deck pool. She'd heard it was more spacious and peaceful. She climbed the stairs and approached the wide glass door, but the attendant at the entrance glanced at her wristband. The color on her card didn't grant access to that area. In a polite but firm tone, he explained that this section was reserved for certain packages only. Mia slipped the card back into her pocket and felt a tightness in her chest. What stopped her wasn't just a color code. It was also her first experience of being excluded from a world her father had built. Ethan had a similar experience when he wanted to go to the ship's playroom. A special section of the kids' club was available only to children of certain guests. His card didn't open that door. The staff member directed him towards the smaller play area on the lower deck. The toys there were older, the computers fewer. At first, Ethan tried not to turn this into a big deal, but as he listened to other kids talk about the upstairs club they got to use, a quiet jealousy crept into him. It wasn't aimed at his father, but at a system he couldn't quite grasp. Watching the small breaks forming in her children, Olivia felt a growing emotion that was equal parts pain and clarity.
For years, she'd believed the comfortable life Alexander provided was a shield protecting the kids. Now she saw how stepping outside that shield was changing them. The experiment wasn't just a mirror for the staff. It was becoming a mirror for them as well. On the cruise side, an invisible tension was building. Mark noticed that the extra attention given to the fake VIPs was disrupting the ship's internal balance. Some staff members had become more impatient and dismissive towards other passengers.
Especially those working in the lower deck dining room had started venting their frustration on the guests who complained least. Olivia and her kids were among them. One evening at dinner, a couple at the next table were loudly complaining about the service speed. When the waiter headed toward their tables, he glanced over at Olivia's family. Their table had only a pitcher of water and basic entrees. Next door, the couple had opened the wine list and ordered extras. The waiter directed his energy and smile to the complaining table, only stopping at Olivia's briefly to fulfill the bare minimum. As Mia watched, she saw something she'd never seen this clearly before: the invisible choices behind people's behavior. She could see how money, appearance, tone of voice, and even the way you complained shaped the quality of service. Olivia filed all of this away in her mind like sentences for a long letter she would write to Alexander later. But at that moment, Alexander was already watching everything from the control room via cameras. On the security screens of the ship's management panel, images streamed from different angles. Fake VIPs laughing on the upper decks, passengers eating at tightly packed tables in the lower dining room, staff expressions, silhouettes in the hallways. Each time Alexander saw his family on those screens, he felt a lump in his throat. When he'd drawn up the plan, he'd weighed everything with analytical coldness. Now he felt small cracks forming in that calm facade. His daughter sat with her head bowed at a table near the kitchen doors. His son turned away from a doorway he wasn't allowed to pass. His wife suffered through rude behavior in silence. Was all of this truly worth it just to see the real faces of his managers? Still, Alexander didn't back down. He believed the experiment needed to run its course. Otherwise, the observations would be incomplete. So he continued taking notes, recording staff names, faces, and behaviors one by one. He paid particular attention to some of the lower dining room employees whose manner had been especially harsh, belittling, or dismissive. When the ship reached Santorini, a day tour of the island was organized for the passengers. The upper-tier guests were taken on luxury minibuses with private guides. Mid-tier guests were transported in more crowded buses. Olivia and the children had a hard time finding seats on the packed bus. The guide's voice barely reached the back rows. Even so, as Mia watched the island's narrow streets, white-domed churches, and cliffs overlooking the sea, she felt a strange sense of freedom. For the first time, she was exploring a place without her father's name attached. No one knew who they were. The only thing they didn't have to hide was their ordinary existence. Meanwhile, the fake VIP group was touring in smaller numbers along a quieter route. Their guide pointed out the best photo spots and offered extra refreshments at each stop. Staff members paid a special attention to this group, working hard to stage perfect moments for their social media posts.
When the passengers returned to the ship, a small incident occurred at boarding. At the entrance reserved for mid-tier guests, the security staff were trying to organize the line. The officer snapped at Olivia and her children, barking instructions at them in a scolding tone. Mia grabbed her mother's arm, struggling to suppress the anger rising inside her. If she revealed their identity right then, everything would change in an instant. But that would break the rules of the experiment. She kept quiet. At the same time, as the fake VIPs entered through a different gate, the same security officer greeted them with almost exaggerated politeness. His voice softened, a wide smile spread across his face as he welcomed them back aboard. Alexander watched this scene on the security feed and added another name to his notebook in bold letters. By the final week of the cruise, the atmosphere aboard Aurora Mare was charged with preparations for the big gala night. This gala, held at the end of every cruise, was the ship's most glamorous event. Passengers wore their finest clothes, and the grand hall filled with music, dancing, and performances for a farewell celebration. For the crew, it was also an invisible test. Under pressure, their true behavior, their capacity for kindness, and the point at which their masks slipped became more apparent than ever. While planning the gala, Alexander also scripted the experiment's finale. That night, in front of everyone, he would reveal his identity and his family's true roles. This reveal would not just be a spectacle, it would mark the beginning of a chain of decisions that would reshape the ship's moral order. A few hours before the gala, a small envelope reached Olivia and the children. Inside were their outfits for the evening and a set of instructions. There were no lines in Alexander's handwriting, just a short, clear note explaining the final step of the plan. They were told to enter the main hall through a side door at a specific time and sit at the table reserved for them. The clothes matched their real world, elegant but not ostentatious. For Olivia, a simple yet refined dress. For Mia, something youthful but sophisticated. For Ethan, the first real suit he had ever worn. When Olivia picked up the dress, a sting ran through her. It wasn't just the beauty of the garment. It was also the weight of the identity that would return to their shoulders as soon as they put it on. The quiet invisibility they'd grown used to over the past weeks would be replaced by a spotlight. The shift would test not only the staff, but them as well. As Mia slipped into her dress and looked in the mirror, all the memories she'd gathered on the ship came back. The dismissive glances, the half-finished responses, the way service always seemed to tilt toward more important tables. The face staring back at her was both the invisible girl from the lower decks and the daughter of the true owner of Aurora Mare. These two identities briefly met and merged in the same body.
When the gala hall opened, it was awash in light. Crystal candle holders, white tablecloths, and thin-stemmed glasses adorned the tables. The stage had been set for the orchestra, and a lectern stood at one corner for special speeches. The crew wore their sharpest uniforms, checking every last detail to ensure perfection. The fake VIP's table was placed in the center of the room, where everyone could see it. As Mark moved around, he took satisfaction in the staff's extra care toward that table. The finest wines were directed there, and the most experienced waiters were assigned to it. Other tables were not neglected, but the subtle difference was obvious to observant eyes. When Olivia, Mia, and Ethan entered through the side door, almost no one noticed. Eyes were fixed on the fake VIP table, on their laughter, photos, and showy gestures. Their own table was near the side of the hall. It had a clear view of the stage, but was far from the thickest part of the crowd. In the first minutes, staff behavior toward them didn't change. They were offered the usual polite but detached service, menus placed on their table with a kind of practiced indifference. But as the night went on, and Alexander stepped onto the stage, the balance of the room shifted in an instant. When Alexander walked up to the lectern, the lights dimmed slightly. The orchestra lowered its volume, and the buzz of conversation in the hall faded into an attentive silence.
Everyone knew he had only been on board for short stretches during the cruise. Most of the crew had never seen his face up close. Now every eye was on the man on stage. His voice, as he began to speak, was neither angry nor overly emotional. It was calm, clear, and measured. He thanked everyone for their efforts over the course of the cruise. He invited the guests to applaud the crew's performance. The hall filled with courteous applause. The crew lived for that moment each voyage, enjoying a fleeting sense of being appreciated. But this time, there was a different tone in what followed. Alexander spoke of a special evaluation carried out during this cruise. He explained that some people among the passengers, whose identities had not been revealed, were in fact very close to him and to the company. They had traveled as ordinary guests to see the true face of the service on board. Across the hall, a subtle wave of unease crossed staff faces. Some glanced toward the fake VIP table, convinced those must be the people he meant. Those seated there, suddenly the focus of attention, felt a mix of pride and surprise.
Without looking at them directly, Alexander continued. Then his tone grew more pointed as he said the time had come to reveal who these special guests were. The room buzzed with a tense curiosity. Finally, he lifted his head, scanned the hall, and gave a slight nod toward the side door. The light slowly shifted away from the stage to a table on the far side. A circle of light fell on the table where Olivia, Mia, and Ethan sat. The family that had gone unnoticed all night was suddenly at the center of the room. When Alexander announced that these three were the family of Aurora Mare's true owner, the silence thickened. The fake VIPs turned toward them in shock. The crew stared at their table, unable to believe what they were seeing. The family who had received no special attention, who had even been dismissed at times, were suddenly revealed as the core of the entire system. Olivia did not stand up under the lights. Neither did Mia or Ethan. They had agreed to be part of this game from the beginning. Now they were simply witnessing its result. There was no gleam of triumph or revenge in their eyes, just the fatigue of people bearing the weight of what they had seen. Some of the crew felt the floor give way beneath them. The head waiter who had been rude in the lower dining room, the security guard who had snapped at Olivia and the children at the gate, the bartender who tailored his service according only to tip potential. All of them were forced in that moment to replay their own behavior in their minds. Alexander stated that all the observations and recordings collected throughout the cruise had been reviewed, and that every staff member would be judged fairly. But he also said bluntly that certain behaviors did not align with the company's values. The difference between passenger classes, he explained, did not translate into a difference in human dignity. Yet some employees had crossed that line. The harshest part of his speech came next. Alexander read out the names on some of the notes he had brought to the stage. These were the employees who had shown consistently rude, belittling, or degrading behavior. It was not just a work announcement, it was a public reckoning. He declared that once the cruise ended, these staff members would no longer be employed on Aurora Mare or any of the company's other ships. Those whose names were called froze in place. Some didn't respond at all. The shock left them speechless. Others opened their mouths to protest, but their voices were swallowed by the atmosphere of the room, which remained focused on the stage and the family in the spotlight.
At the same time, Alexander spoke of the positive behaviors he had seen. He named staff members who showed equal respect and care to all guests, regardless of card color or clothes. Those who remained patient even at the busiest times. Servers who restored people's sense of worth through small, thoughtful gestures. When he read their names, a small but sincere applause spread through the hall.
It wasn't just an acknowledgement of good service. It was a celebration of remaining human. Listening to all of this, Olivia tried to decide whether she was still angry with Alexander. The experiment had tested their ability to be a family, forcing each of them to confront painful truths about themselves in the world. Yet she now saw not only the steel of a boss in his expression, but also the fragility of a husband and father. As he stood on stage trying to appear strong, he chose his words carefully to hide his guilt. As Mia scanned the faces around the room, she wasn't thinking solely about revenge or being proven right. Over the last weeks, she had learned to see herself and others in a new way. She had glimpsed the calculations behind smile lines, the weight carried by quiet people, the insecurity of those who spoke loudly to hide their fears. Now that her identity had returned, she didn't want to ignore what she had learned. Ethan watched his father's silhouette against the stage lights and for the first time in years formed a clear thought in his mind instead of swallowing it. My dad isn't just a powerful man. He's someone who can make mistakes and try to fix them. That thought carried a quiet grief for the childhood he hadn't fully experienced, but also the possibility of a more honest relationship in the future. The gala never fully returned to its previous rhythm after the announcement. The music continued, but there was a slight hesitation in the steps of those who danced. The staff, as they moved from table to table, examined each face more carefully than before. Not knowing who anyone really was no longer brought just anxiety, it brought responsibility. By the time Aurora Mare returned to port at the end of the cruise, an unseen order inside the ship had shifted. Those who were dismissed packed their belongings silently. Some were angry. Some were remorseful. A few saw the whole thing as an unfair game. Others understood it as a harsh mirror held up to their own faces. For those who kept their jobs, nothing would be the same again. Any passenger could now be someone evaluating them. More importantly, every passenger, regardless of status, was a human being deserving of respect. This idea, once merely a line in company policy, began to seep into day-to-day behavior. As Alexander disembarked with his family, he cast a brief look at Olivia walking beside him. There was still a great deal left unsaid between them. The experiment hadn't magically solved all their problems, but at least they now stood inside the same story. Neither was looking down from above or up from below. They both stood on the same deck, stepping onto the same concrete pier.
Mia turned for one last look at the ship and stared at the name Aurora Mare. To her, it was no longer just a luxurious vacation memory. It had become the place where she'd witnessed the hidden architecture of social classes, stolen glances, and critical decisions. She promised herself that when she built her own life one day, she wouldn't unconsciously replicate that architecture. Ethan swung his backpack over his shoulder, carrying with him the possibility of making his first independent choices. Maybe one day he would choose a life with nothing to do with the sea, or maybe he would choose something related to it, but built on entirely different values. Whatever path he took, he would remember that people should be judged by their actions, not their status. Aurora Mare, in the meantime, was being prepared for its next voyage. Its hull still broke the sunlight at the same angle. When it left port again, the trail of foam it drew on the water would look the same. But the people inside it would not be. The ship's metal frame appeared unchanged, yet something new flowed between the decks, the quiet, heavy weight of a lesson learned. Back in his office, Alexander archived the security footage and reports. He didn't know whether this experiment would ever be repeated. Perhaps it would be recreated on other ships in other forms, but he understood one thing. Real power did not lie in hiding who you were. It lay in knowing who you were and choosing to act fairly, regardless of who stood before you.
That evening, when the family returned home and stepped through the front door, there was no special ceremony. The same paintings hung in the hallway, the same lamp stood in the corner of the living room. And yet the air inside the house had changed, if only slightly. It no longer smelled solely of expensive furnishings and carefully planned days, but also of a shared experience, of a bittersweet reckoning. As Olivia unpacked, she didn't fold away the plain clothes she'd worn on the ship into some forgotten corner of the wardrobe. She hung them where she could see them easily. For her, they were not costumes from a temporary game, but mementos that had widened her view of the world. Whenever she opened the wardrobe to choose a luxury dress, she would see those simple garments hanging beside it and remember the lower dining room on Aurora Mare. Mia went to her room and sat at her desk. She opened her notebook and wrote the first sentence. On a ship, when you don't say who you are, everyone treats you as who they assume you to be. That line might become the opening of a story she would write one day. In that story, the names might still be English, the cities still bright, the sea still blue, but this time her characters' truths would not be hidden in the colors of their cards, but in the choices they made.
Lying in bed, Ethan didn't think about the playroom he'd been denied. Instead, Santorini's wind and the quiet of its narrow streets came to mind. He wanted, one day, to build a life where he could travel on his own. Maybe he'd find a place where he could be respected without having to show a card at all. As Aurora Mare filled again for a new voyage, fresh passengers and stories took their places on board. But this time, when the crew walked the decks, they might pause a moment longer at each table and consider who might be sitting there. Some lessons once learned are never forgotten, especially when they're taught in the middle of the sea with nowhere to escape. Thank you for listening. Be sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our next story.